So this is probably gonna be another late ass video, my bad on that. I spent the entire day setting some shit up. But anywho, let's get into the video. Lookism, the manhwa we all know and love, is a manhwa that has evolved or devolved depending on your personal preference from a manhwa about Lookism to a manhwa still about Lookism, just not to the extent it was initially. It is a manhwa about fighting, we don't really have anyone to try to fool, and the fighters that partake in said fighting in this manhwa are mostly divided into three groups by time of activity. These three groups are the generations. The generation that started everything goes by the name of the pre-generation, and the generation that follows, the first generation, is also called the generation of war or the generation of circles, and the generation we're currently in is called the second generation. None of this is groundbreaking stuff, we should all be familiar with this by now. However, in a fighting manhwa, a topic that is always bound to arise in most conversations no matter how much you try to avoid it is power scaling, or put more simply, strength. A fighting enthusiast will inevitably find himself curious as to who will win in a fight between one person and the other, whether it be fighting style or character motivated. And as a result of this, a question that has lingered in the Lookism scene since the dawn of time, always followed by a rather obvious answer, now appears to be not so obvious all of a sudden. And that question is, amongst the three generations of fighters Lookism has to offer, which one is the strongest? Is it the pre-generation, the one started by Gaprion Kim to protect South Korea from the Yamazaki, and based on Kim Do-han's legend with the Yakuza? Or is it the first generation, the generation filled with so much turmoil it was dubbed the generation of war? Perhaps it's neither. For all we know, it could be the generation we're currently in, the second generation, and the one that holds the highest potential. Well, in this video, I'm gonna give it my best shot at finding the answer to this question. To begin with though, we must first set our foundation, which is something I like to do in these kinds of videos, especially as of late. The important question that begs itself here would be, what fighters count as part of a specific generation and what fighters don't? For instance, Jang Gun and Gu Kim. These two are some of the strongest fighters in the series, if not the strongest ever as of right now, depending on which argument you're running and whose agenda you'd like to push. But the question is, what generation do these two belong to? Because there are so many arguments floating around. You have the Gen 2 argument of these fighters being active after Generation 1 ended, therefore they're part of Gen 2. But then you have Gu denying Gun and Gu's involvement in the generations, which you'd have to wonder why PTJ would want to write that into the series in the first place. Then you have the Gen 1.5 argument of people saying Gun, Gu, and Sinu belong to a fictional generation assigned by PTJ called Gen 1.5, which is a time period before the start of the second generation, however after the end of the first. Well, to make things sweet and simple, not overcomplicating it while also making sure the video is still entertaining, as for Gen 2, I'm gonna count Gun and Gu as part of the generation as well as Sinu Han. And as for the pre-generation, since I have not read any other manhwa than Lookism, and I'm unable to really make an honest attempt at scaling characters like Manager Kim in their prime, I'm just gonna stick to what we've seen in Lookism, and I'm gonna include Senior Manager Kim as part of the pre-generation's team. Characters like Braktak, Hansu, Jinchol, or anyone else we don't really get much about in the series of Lookism is not gonna be included in this video, but if you get a different answer from your knowledge on these characters, then that's completely up to you. Now as for which generation is the strongest, we'd obviously have to go through the strongest candidates from each generation and put them in a comparison with their counterparts. So how about we start with Gaprion Kim's generation, Gen 0. The pre-generation, though known for being the authentic first generation and the generation that started it all, is actually also accredited for its unity. That generation was united like no other, and that can be attributed to two things: Gaprion Kim uniting forces deliberately to take down a great power, as well as there not being that many fighters to begin with. Not nearly as many prominent names are heard from the pre-generation Lookism as the first generation, or potentially even the second. A very ameliorative impact this unity leaves on the generation though is that although their numbers may not be extraordinary, like having more than 20 first generation kings and parties, individuals in the pre-generation are extraordinarily strong in their own right. Starting with Gapriong's fist, these names include Gaprion Kim, the alleged pinnacle of the verse, according to most at least, Elite, Jin Young Park, Tom Lee, Baeko Kwan, Bongye Choi, Jae-soo No, Gwang Gyu, and some other names like Gentlemen that we aren't too familiar with. Gapriong alone is of course speculated to be the pinnacle of the verse, however, with the existence of other arguments, the reason this question is no longer as obvious as it once was is now apparent, and the great power Gapriong's fist united to take down is of course the Yamazaki Syndicate. A syndicate of course includes subordinate clans, and those will be mentioned too, led in the pre-generation by Shingen Yamazaki, followed by Shintaro Yamazaki, who was the real Shingen all along. These two fighters alone, especially Shingen, rival some of the strongest in the verse, with Shingen implied to be Gapriong's strongest foe and arch nemesis. There's also a third member speculated to be on par with Shingen and Shintaro, whom we do not see much from in the series. If anything actually, all we really see is one panel. However, from what we can tell, he is a fighter at least on par with Shintaro, as Shingen's strength is only really replicated by someone like Gapriong. And finally, the Kojima brothers, or in other words, the twin frauds, whom don't really contribute much to the pre-generation if anything at all. This leaves the pre-generation's Incheon side, that being Peichon, Joe, and Yu Gang Ha, both of whom we know literally literally nothing about when it comes to fighting, as well as one of the pre-generation's individual fighters, that being Jinwoo Jin, whom likewise we know virtually nothing about. Of course, there's also Senior Manager Kim, who I'm gonna include because, as I mentioned, he seems to be one of the only ones from the external PTJ manhwa side that we really get anything from in Lookism. Now that we've listed off the entirety of the pre-generation's prominent names, we can move on to the first generation. And this generation, similar to the pre-generation, ended quite abruptly and in quick, uninterrupted fashion, all as a result of the work of two men, one of which is the son of the pre-generation's leader, Gaprion Kim. This generation, though, unlike the pre-generation, was not united in the slightest, and in fact, the entire point behind the generation was its division and constant conflict between parties, in other words, the generation of war. And as a result of this division, strength in this generation fluctuates, with some of its kings being rather weak and others being at the pinnacle of the verse. And the two men who ended this generation are the men who sit at the top when it comes to strength, those being Ki-tae Kim and James Lee, speculated to be relative in fighting prowess by most. And these two men are followed by the regional kings, and this is where the irony is revealed in noticing that the less involved a fighter or king was with war in the first generation, the stronger they really were, with Seongji being a prominent example, the strongest first generation king to many and a man that lived in a mountain with those close to him. His battle with James Lee in the first generation ended interrupted, and though it's assumed that James would have won the fight had it continued, it was because of Seongji that James broke new limits and became as strong as he actually is. Jin Rang as well, following Seongji, was a man that spent mostly his entire generation in prison. Another prominent names of course include Ji Chang, Taesu, Gangseop, Seokdu, and kings of pretty much every region you could really think of, ranging from the Gyeonggi-do province with Juhyuk, Shobu, and Jaemin. It really just never ends. This is almost all for the first generation, save for the two kings whom their strength we're not exactly entirely familiar with, the two half-assed kings of Incheon, Jaegyeonna and Yoo Jae-seon, in their respective parties. Moving on to the second generation. Upon listing all the prominent members from every generation, it becomes a lot easier for us to compare and contrast the fighters side by side and deduce which generation would end up being the strongest, and if the generations were grouped, with each generation being its own team, which generation would come out on top, disregarding of course the fact that if in character, these fighters would definitely end up betraying each other. So as for the second generation, the two men that stand at the top are Jong-gun Park, son of the pre-generation legend of the Yamazaki Syndicate, Tiger Demon and rival of Gaprion Kim, as well as Junggu Kim, just a guy that likes money really. And these two men have always been portrayed as equal, and though in their fight the result was far from a draw, there are outliers we have to take into account and unexpected circumstances that, when addressed, keep these two on equal footing. The second generation has a lot of fighters and is divided into crews from every region you can really think of. In Seoul, you have the four major crews, starting with God Dog led by Johan, who is also one of the strongest characters in the series, the reason behind which I will explain shortly, followed by Big Deal led by Jake Kim and formerly Sinu Han, and including members such as Jerry Kwan, Jason and Brad, Lineman, formerly Samuel so on and so forth, Hostel led by Eli, formerly Ollie and former to the formerly Eli again, and including members such as Warren Che, Max and Derek, so on and so forth. And then we have the workers and all of their respective executives and affiliates, including notable fighters such as Yu Sung, Mandiok, Ryuhei, Basement Hulk, and that's pretty much fucking it. And you then have Ansan Public, Gukim's secret friends, the Burn Knuckles, Backdoor, and other smaller crews who mostly would just serve as numbers in this setting. And Allied, of course, is the primary party in the second generation though, and it is led by the main character and includes Vasco, Zack, Vinjin, Hudson, Jay, and to some, Jihan Kwok and his brother Ji Byung. Now that the tedious part is over and that we've listed all the prominent fighters from every generation, we can finally find out which generation is the strongest. So let's assume a scenario where the generations were teams and they had to fight to the death with only one generation being able to come out alive. Which would it be? In my opinion, the easiest way to go about this is to divide these fighters into ranking by fighting prowess, which can be done rather quickly. In the pre-generation's S tier, we have Gaprion Kim and Shingen. In its A tier, we would have Elite, Shintaro, Mujin, Beiko Kwan, and potentially Peichon and Yugang. In its B tier, we would have Jin Young, Tom Lee, Shintaro 2, and potentially Senior Manager Kim. And the pre-generation's C tier includes fighters like the Kojimas, low tiers in Gapriong's Fist, and so on. The first generation's S tier are just James and Ki-tae. Nobody is on their level in the generation. However, the A tier includes Seongji, Jinrang, Jaegyeon, and Yoo-jae. The B tier is Ji Chang, Taesu, Gangseop, and Juhyuk, whilst the C tier includes all of the smaller regional kings as well as the squad leaders in the Dark Society, speed members, and circle executives in the first generation. And for the second generation, the S tier includes Gun, Gu, and UI Big Daniel. The A tier is Johan and UI Lil Daniel, and the B tier for the second generation is stacked, as it includes fighters such as the prominent allied members Zack, Vasco, and Vinjin, as well as executives of the workers Eli Jang and Jake and Sinu, as well as Samuel and Taejin, and the rest are below. Now, each of the generation's tiers have their own standards, and one generation's S tier is stronger than the others. However, due to them going by the same ranking system of tiers, that becomes the whole point. The way we're gonna figure figure this out is comparing each tier for a specific generation to that of another. As for C tier, the pre-generation unfortunately does not really compare to the others because although the Yamazaki Syndicate have crazy numbers, the Dark Society alone can replicate that, except smaller regional kings alone may very well be enough. This leaves the first generation and the second generation, and the second generation does not compare either, so the first generation takes the C tier pretty easily, which is no surprise for the generation of war. Moving on to the B tier, which is where it starts to get a lot spicier. The pre-generation's B tier having Jin Young and Tom alone is pretty major, but also having a fighter who is potentially just below the level of Shintaro, of course without the UI, as well as senior manager Kim. This makes the pre-generation's B tier notable enough already. Putting it into comparison with that of the second generation though makes it clear that the B tier for pretty much all of the generations is pretty notable. I mean, we have Zack, Vasco, Vengeance, Eli, Jake, Sinu. These are all pretty strong fighters, and even though individually they're not as strong as the likes of Jin Young or Tom Lee, definitely not in their primes at least, the question becomes, would these fighters beat the four of Jin Young, Tom, senior manager Kim, and someone on par with no UI Shintaro on their own? And personally, I don't think so. We have to take into account that fighters like this in their prime, Jin Young and Tom, would give someone like Kite Kim a run for his money, so putting four of these together, I just don't think the second generation's B tier is enough. Not even the first generation as a matter of fact. The pre-generation's B tier of fighters is just the better version of that of the first generation. Now let's move on to the final two tiers, A tier and S tier. Comparing the strongest fighters of each generation is always going to be inevitably the most crucial step in figuring out which generation is the strongest. As for the pre-generation, this includes very big names such as Elite, Shintaro, Mujin, Beiko Kwan, and potentially Peichon and Yugang. In other words, the Gapryong's fifth second in command, Gapryong's sword, and the two pre-generation kings of Enchon. As for the second generation, we have Johan and UI Lil Daniel, and the reason Johan is such a wild card here is because Johan has a path, and paths are one of the most controversial topics in Lookism to this date, because it's extremely difficult not only to figure out how the system works, but also who would and wouldn't have a path. You have this Tom Lee statement or speech pretty much telling us straight up that a non-path user would never be able to defeat a path user, and up to our knowledge, Gu Kim does not have a path, or at least has not forged the path fully yet, as opposed to someone like Gun. Tom Lee, the same man who just made that statement, says he wouldn't know who's stronger between the two, so... And after talking it over with one of my friends for a while, I think the argument that makes the most sense is that though a path user will always be on a different level than one without a path, I think physical stats do matter, and I still believe if a dwarf had their own path, it would likely not work against someone built like Beiko Kwan. In my personal opinion, I still believe that if their stats are just enough far apart, one's path can be trumped by their opponent. At least that's the conclusion I've reached so far, but this point is open to discussion. So I suppose if you believe path users could never lose to someone without a path, then as for the second generation's B tier, we have a confirmed path user in the series, that being Johan Seong, joined by UI Little Daniel, so that would take out Elite, Beiko, Shintaro, and I'm not sure as to whether or not Mujin, Peichon, or Yugang have a path. However, it's safe to say though that the second generation's B tier gets absolutely dog-walked by that of the pre-generation, and the first generation's A tier, that being Seongji, Jinrang, and Jaegyeon, and Yuja, can have the same thing said about them, because as far as we know, the whole path thing cannot be applied to Jinrang, Jaegyeon, or Yuja, so it would just be a 6v4, and the pre-generation again would end up stomping. You could make the argument that Seongji has surpassed Mujin, so he would take him out, and that Yuja and Jaegyeon could take out Peichon and Yugang, because fuck knows what could happen. Jinrang would still need to take out Shintaro, Elite, and Beiko though, which is just not fucking happening. So far, the pre-generation's A tier fighters has been the strongest, as well as the B tier. However, the first generation takes the C tier. As far as the S tier goes, this would probably be the most controversial topic you can touch on when it comes to power scaling and Lookism. It is a 2v2v2, Gun and Gu versus Shingen and Gapryong versus Kite and James. I think when it comes to the second and first generation, the S tier matters so much more than the other tiers due to the sheer difference in strength between the peak of the generation and those below. The difference in strength between Gun and Gu and someone like UI Little Daniel is stark as fuck, as well as the difference between someone like Kite and Jaegyeon, as opposed to the difference between Shingen and Shintaro, for example, though still huge as displayed by their fight, just not as one-sided. The only way to really go about this is just to dive right into it, but before that, I would like to point out the reason I think Gun and Gu are virtually on the same tier. So as you all know, Gun is a path user, and from what we know, Gu isn't. However, despite this, throughout the entire series, all the way up to their battle, and even throughout their battle, PTJ still goes out of his way to paint the narrative that these two were equals. Not for shock value for the result, but in my opinion to build something more meaningful. The matchup between Gun and Gu was nothing short of unfair, and it always has been. Matching a swordsman up against a person who quite literally cannot be cut by said sword is never gonna go well for the swordsman, and PTJ is completely aware of this from the moment he writes this rivalry into the story. However, he still decides to paint the narrative that these two are equal. But why would they be on the same level if one of them cannot physically take down the other? Because PTJ wants to build something more for Gu's character. It is something I've been saying since the dawn of time, and as the Inshon saga approaches its conclusion and the Hwarang sword inches closer to Gu's hands, it is only really a matter of time before we realize that Gu is inevitably going to be the counter to Gun's backbone, and that is the whole reason he's been the person to be highlighted as Gun's equal for the entirety of the series, despite being physically unable to beat him due to being a swordsman, and for that reason, I believe Hwarangu and TUI Gun are on the same level, with Gu winning the matchup if it ever happened. Now, as far as which generation will end up being the strongest, there is something we have to take into account, which is the value of each generation's peak, and whether or not the pinnacle of a generation being the strongest alone would make it the strongest generation. There is a new argument floating around in the Lookism community, which states that the peak of every generation would end up being stronger than the one before it. Therefore, Gun and Gu would be stronger than James and Kite, and James and Kite would be stronger than Gapryong and Shingen. Now, whether or not you believe in this can wait, but as for a hypothetical where this is the case, we would also have to take two things into account. First of all, Gun and Gu aren't the peak of the second generation in the sense that they were not made for that, and though Gu's statements regarding him and Gun not caring about generations are disregarded, they are still valuable in the sense that PTJ is trying to tell us that the peak of the second generation is not meant to be Gun and Gu. The peak of the second generation is meant to be someone like Daniel Park. This is important because if we were to try to present the argument that the peak of every generation is stronger than the one before it, Gun and Gu wouldn't be who we were referring to when it comes to the second gen, it would be the likes of Daniel. And so to finalize, if you were to include UI Daniel, then the second generation is obviously just the strongest. However, if you were to exclude UI Daniel due to not having a path yet, not being at his highest potential, and also the paradox of perfection, then this question becomes a lot less obvious. Now, if you were to say that Gun and Gu are the strongest and that the second generation's S tier as of right now is the peak of the verse, then this begs the question as to how much it matters, because if we go back to what we were saying earlier, none of the other tiers, A tier, B tier, or C tier went to the second generation, as opposed to if you were to say Gapryong and Shingen are the strongest, then it would be just clear as day that the strongest generation is the pre-generation. And if you believe that James and Kite are the strongest due to being the final antagonists of the series, it would beg the same exact question for the same exact reason. Therefore, if the second generation's peak being the strongest still doesn't make it the strongest, likewise for the first generation, doesn't that just make the pre-generation the peak? And the short answer is yes. Because even if you were to say that Gun and Gu are stronger than Gapryong and Shingen, they certainly aren't strong enough to make up for the A, B, and C tier all at once. And James and Kite potentially being stronger than Gapryong and Shingen is unlikely to begin with because Kite hasn't even unlocked his path fully yet as opposed to his father. So the short and sweet answer from my interpretation is the pre-generation is currently the strongest, though this is subject to change and will change, because in my opinion, the second generation is going to be the strongest generation by the end of the series.